Very good. So, good afternoon. I meant to prepare this a while ago. The snow got to me. Um, Karen, my wife, said to me to be careful out there. You don't want to overdo it. And I said, well, overdo? Yeah, I went in and shoveled all the snow, and then I came in and I did 30 minutes on the bicycle, and then the rest of the week I was just wiped out as the weekend came. So I'm getting back. Catching up, and I appreciate your patience. And what I wanted to do today was something different. I am, and I will, let me share my screen. There we go. And let me get this up. All right, so I have a transcript. I will post this, but I'm trying to do something different. Combining my remarks for each of my classes into one set of comments meant for all of my students. I'm teaching the history of business in America and Michigan history and the US history from 1877. And we're all now well into the 20th century. My US class is now at the Great Depression and the New Deal. My business history students were just asked to respond to an hour and a half documentary and give me their opinions on the question of, are corporations evil? At the same time, Michigan history students are reading Anna Clark's book on the Flint crisis. And one theme that runs through that is the nature of all of these things, is the nature of the modern corporation. First, let me start by repeating something that has been repeated many times in my business history class. The corporation is the dominant institution of our world. Think about it. Once upon a time, the Catholic Church was the dominant institution in Europe. The Pope put the crown on the king's head. But then came the Protestant Reformation, and the kings and monarchs became dominant institutions, and the churches became less powerful. In England, King Henry VIII made himself the head of the church and put the crown on his own head. He didn't need the Pope, and his bishops served the king. The king became more powerful than the church. As I pointed out in my History 122 class, the monarchies and empires of Europe crashed in World War I. The Russian Empire collapsed, and the Tsarist Empire was replaced by the Soviet state. The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire also collapsed, and the modern world was born. And from that point, the nation state became the dominant institution in the modern world. But after World War II, the nation state began to lose to the rising multinationals, corporations that had more money than whole countries, corporations that spanned the globe and that had their own armies and diplomats. That is what I mean by when I say the corporation is the dominant institution in our world. Now, we need to understand the significance of this fact. What is the significance for you and I that the corporation is now the dominant institution of our time? Think about the corporations that are everywhere around us: McDonald's, Apple, Google, Facebook, Walmart, Nestle's. Most of you probably have never given it a second thought to any of this. And when I asked my business history students what they thought, most of them, even after watching an hour and a half documentary that described the modern corporation as overwhelmingly harmful to the planet and everything that lives on it, still most came up with the tired cliche that the video itself presented and debunked: the idea that there are a few bad apples, but most of the corporations are good, and the profit motive is good, and we're all better off living under a system of modern corporations. I should say at this point that I know very well that I'm not going to convince any of you of anything. That isn't even my job. I've been teaching for over 30 years, and I don't believe that I've convinced a student who strongly disagreed with me that I was right and they were wrong, ever. Notice that I use the singular. I don't believe that I have ever convinced a student, but then I went on in the same sentence to use the plural noun, they. By the rules of grammar, I should have chosen he or she. We use a is a singular, then use a singular pronoun. But by the new convention of our language is to use the plural when you want to avoid choosing a gender. That is why some people want to be referred to as they rather than he or she. The reason for this, we now understand, is because there aren't just two genders, male and female. There are people who are born with both a vagina and a penis, but there are people who are born with only one set of genitals who have varied genes. Like instead of an XY, which most men have, some people have XXY or XYY. Nature isn't as simple as we tend to think. And we've gotten to the point in history where, at least in some cultures, there's a new awareness that people have a right to choose how they want to be identified. And that has a lot to do with the very public appearance of transgender people who are well known and beloved and as one gender, and then they turn up as a new person and a new gender. Here's a picture of the famous transgender model, Angela Pejic. And I mean, she has modeled both as a man and as a woman. I said before that it's worth repeating. Everything we ever thought we knew for sure has turned out to be completely false. And think about it. We grew up thinking that there were two genders, male and female. Back in history, there was a time when it was generally believed that the sun went around the earth. We believed that the earth was the center of the universe. We believed that the Milky Way galaxy was the entire universe, right up to 1924, when Edwin Hubble, using a powerful new telescope on Mount Wilson, was able to resolve that fuzzy little spot that was called the Andromeda Nebula. He showed that it wasn't in the Milky Way galaxy at all. It was a whole galaxy of its own, even bigger than our galaxy, and it was 2.5 million light years from us. He then realized that all those fuzzy spots were galaxies, and suddenly we understood that the universe was billions of times larger than we imagined. Most of you have heard about all this from movies about space and travel, and perhaps from a smattering of science instruction but you really don't know the half of it. The last 20 years have been a golden age for astronomy, and most of you probably know very little of the revolutionary discoveries that have been made. We now know, for example, that our universe is expanding ever more rapidly, driven by mysterious forces that we call dark matter and dark energy. Everything we ever thought we knew for certain has turned out to be mistaken. Shouldn't that lead us to wonder about all the things that you think are true right now? How do you know what you know? Why do you just accept all the things you are told? And that is why I really can't convince you to accept my arguments about what is true. If you're a Trump supporter, I'm not going to turn you into a Democrat. If you're a Christian, I'm not going to convince you to convert to Judaism. In fact, it's worth knowing that as a Jew, I'm not even interested in converting you to Judaism. Jews don't generally do that. Maybe you never thought of the difference between Jews and Christians and Muslims, but one basic difference is that Christianity and Islam are evangelical religions. That is, they believe it would be a really good idea if everyone would recognize that their religion is the one true religion. There are some 2.4 billion Christians in the world, 1.8 billion Muslims, and only 14 million Jews. The reason that there are 2,400 million Christians and only 14 million Jews is that Christians send out missionaries to bring people the good news. Jews don't do that. In fact, traditionally, Jews have discouraged people from converting to Judaism. We don't want you. It is possible to convert to Judaism, but it isn't easy. So let's be clear. I'm not here to teach you anything. My father used to say, we live in hope. And the hope that I have is that I might get you to think about things that you never thought about, that you will continue to come to your own conclusions and whatever they are. And that will have nothing to do with your grade in the course. I don't give students grades because they agree with me or bad students because they disagree with me. But I do have my own thoughts about the nature of reality. And what I want to do today is to give you a brief introduction to how I see the modern corporation in the world today. Let me summarize. We have known since the early 1990s that fossil fuel companies were altering the planet's climate in ways that threatened life on the planet, just as we have known since the 1960s that tobacco smoking caused cancer. No one was more aware of the dangers of tobacco than the tobacco companies themselves. Yet I grew up with commercials that insisted tobacco was good for me. After all, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. My point is that you and I both grew up in a world in which the messages repeated over and over are formulated by corporations trying to get us to consume things, and virtually everything they're trying to get us to consume is bad for us and bad for the environment. And nothing is worse for the environment than fossil fuels. I've been following the science since the 1990s. After all, I teach the history of science. And for over 30 years, I've been teaching what was known about climate change and species extinction. From the 1990s on, scientists have been warning that we were warming the planet. Most people didn't mind. What harm could there be if the world was 1 degree warmer? Hey, it would be nice to have it a little bit warmer. And a bit more carbon dioxide would be appreciated by the plants. After all, they breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. We breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. But the scientists predict that we were in for a lot of serious trouble. Consider what the United States will look like in a few decades. We'll take a moment, watch a little bit of this.
This is rice. Think it's good for you? Think again.
We'll skip the ad, okay?
The Earth's climate is changing. This is a fact. As the planet warms up, ice will melt, ocean waters expand, and storms become more energetic, altogether pushing more water onto land than ever before. While the degree to which sea levels rise is still highly dependent on the action we take now and in the immediate future, elevation maps are old news, so we don't need to wait to see what will happen if we don't reverse our carbon output. From the year 1900 to 2016, the ocean rose by approximately 21 centimeters, while the human population rose from 1.5 billion to over 7 billion, and carbon emissions went from 2 billion tons to 36 billion tons annually. All this means is that we're going to observe even greater increases in sea level year after year for the rest of the century, with estimates of a 38 centimeter rise by 2100, which by my calculations should be near the end of yours and my lifetime. Meaning these are the lands that we all have to worry about right now. Now, before I get started, I find it important to note that the process of flooding a coast, just like all other natural processes, will be a gradual one. Nowhere is just going to flood overnight, but rather storm after storm will wear down on the coast and wash away any loose ground, until finally, when the storm surge recedes, we'll find less land where there previously had been. Now, it's pretty arbitrary where we start on this one, so let's just begin by looking at North America. After all, it's here that the United States has historically emitted more total greenhouse gases than any other country. Plus, it's here that we'll get a nice introduction to all of the different landforms that fall most vulnerable to the rising sea. Looking at Florida on our elevation map, we'll find essentially the entire peninsula sitting flat and low. This is the result of how the Florida landmass was constructed, as the millions of shells of dead sea creatures fell to the ocean floor and piled on top of one another, they slowly cemented under their own pressure into one solid limestone deposit, the bedrock of the peninsula. The only problem with this type of land formation is that it depends on gravity to distribute where the shells collect. And since gravity prefers perfect spheres, this produces an incredibly flat landscape. This explains why over half of the Florida peninsula is already underwater, and how even the smallest increase in sea levels can drastically alter the peninsula's standing against the ocean. The nearby Bahama banks were built in a similar way, only the carbonate sediments here didn't have as much foundational bedrock as those in Florida, resulting in an even more submerged limestone shelf. Even more so than Florida, the Bahamas sit directly in the path of hurricanes, which, as they continue to grow in magnitude and frequency, will only accelerate the demise of these islands. Fortunately, these types of limestone landforms are kind of rare. Unfortunately, a far more common method of building land against the ocean is through river sediment deposition. You see, as rainwater becomes runoff, it picks up a lot of loose soil and rocks along its way to the ocean. This sediment load stays suspended in the fast-moving river water until something like reaching the ocean slows it down and allows all the dirt to settle out. This is how river deltas are constructed, which just so happen to be some of humanity's favorite places to set up camp. The only problem is, again, gravity, which dictates where these sediments fall, and therefore, again, results in an exceedingly flat landscape. This, combined with the fact that river deltas by nature form on the coast, is why we'll see the nearby Mississippi River Delta submitting more and more to the ocean each year. To make matters worse, all that sediment that built up the delta must have come from somewhere, usually having eroded from the banks of the river itself, carving out a nice channel for ocean water to push even deeper into Louisiana and destroying some of the country's most productive farmland in the process. Cornfields and Disney World aren't the only things at stake for the United States, however. And looking at the country's Atlantic coast, where most of the people live, we can see that while the Appalachian Mountains do a fair job at holding back the ocean, any land that falls on the other side of the range is up for grabs. This includes the Delmarva Peninsula, where over 1.5 million people live, and which we can see sits almost entirely at sea level, meaning it won't take much before the entire state of Delaware plus good chunks of Maryland and Virginia have disappeared. Further north, we'll find the third highly vulnerable type of landform, glacial deposits. If you watched my geography of the Ice Age video, you'd remember that this part of the continent was encompassed by glaciers just a few thousand years ago. And very similar to rivers, where a glacier ends, all the rock and rubble it picked up along the way is deposited in one big mound called a moraine. This type of land building has resulted in the formation of places like Long Island and Cape Cod. The only issue here is that being built out of loose rubble means there's virtually no solid bedrock here to reinforce the land against tidal forces. The only reason these spits of land are still around at all is because they're both only approximately 20,000 years old, which is incredibly young on a geologic scale and means it won't take much for them to wash away. Okay, so far we've only looked at lands made vulnerable because they protrude into the ocean, but water can also intrude onto land. For an example of what this looks like, we can move over to America's west coast. Here we can clearly see California's Central Valley against the Sierra Nevada mountains. What originally started as a large inland sea filled in over time as sediments from the encompassing mountains settled out, in the end laying down a huge but flat valley floor. Meaning that with sea levels on the rise, each successive storm will send water deeper into the basin from the San Francisco Bay, where it would meet little to no resistance on its way to refilling this basin. Contrary to the previous few examples, however, this is a rather preventable disaster if steps are taken now, as all it would take would be a dam somewhere across the San Francisco Bay. Heck, make that dam power a desalinization plant and you're even one step closer to solving California's water insecurity problem while you're at it. But okay.
Okay. Bring that one down. Scientists in the 1990s said that storms would get worse and that there would be more of them. Wonder of wonders, we now have an average of 30 tropical storms a year instead of 15. And wow, what kinds of storms. These hurricanes are flooding entire cities. New Orleans, which had lost half of its population between 2000 and 2006. It's recovered some since then, but like Detroit, it has lost a lot of its appeal. I have family living in my hometown, New York City, who have been driven out of their high-rise apartments 3 times since Sandy in 2012. Sandy wiped away whole stretches of the New Jersey shore, which have never been rebuilt. And since the 1990s, scientists have been warning that fires and drought would get worse and that as the world warmed. And we have seen this prediction after prediction coming true, with fires raging not only across the United States, but the Amazon and the Arctic. Here is the result. As a result of massive fires, deforestation, we are losing the tree cover of the planet very rapidly. Here is another example of the crimes of corporations. Of all the threats facing the oceans today, overfishing takes the greatest toll on sea life and people. Overfishing is catching too many fish at once, so the breeding population becomes too depleted to recover. Overfishing often goes hand in hand with wasteful types of commercial fishing that haul in massive amounts of unwanted fish or animals, which are then discarded. Here's a bit of a book I highly recommend, Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything. Quote, as of 1995, some 37,000 industrial-sized fishing ships, plus about 1 million smaller boats, were between them taking twice as many fish from the sea as they had just 25 years earlier. Trawlers are sometimes as big as cruise ships and haul behind them nets big enough to hold a dozen jumbo jets. Some even use spotter planes to locate shoals offshore from the air. It is estimated that a quarter of every fishing net haul contains bycatch, fish that can't be landed because they're too small or they're the wrong type or caught in the wrong season. As one observer said to The Economist, we're still in the dark ages. We just drop a net down and pull up and see what we have. Perhaps as much as 22 million metric tons of such unwanted fish are dumped back into the sea each year, mostly in the form of corpses. For every pound of shrimp harvested, 4 pounds of fish have been and other marine creatures are destroyed. Large areas of the North Sea floor are dragged clean by beam trawlers as many as 7 times a year, a degree of disturbance that no ecosystem can withstand. At least 2/3 of the species of the Northern Sea, by my estimate, are being overfished. Across the Atlantic, things are no better. Halibut once abounded in such areas off New England that individual boats could land 20,000 pounds in a single day. Now, halibut is all but extinct off the coast of North America. Nothing, however, compares with the fate of cod. In the late 15th century, the explorer John Cabot found cod in incredible numbers on the east banks of the North American shallow areas of water popular with bottom-feeding fish like cod. Some of these banks were vast. Georges Bank were vast. Georges Bank off of Massachusetts is bigger than the state it abuts. The Grand Banks off of Newfoundland is bigger still, and for centuries was always dense with cod, and they were thought to be inexhaustible. Of course, they were anything but. By 1960, the number of spawning cod in the North Atlantic had fallen to an estimated 1.6 million metric tons. And by 1990, that had sunk to 22,000 metric tons. In commercial terms, the cod were extinct. Fishermen, wrote Mark Kurlansky in his fascinating history of cod, had caught them all. The cod may have lost the Western Atlantic forever. In 1992, cod fishing was stopped altogether on the Grand Banks, but in last autumn, according to a report in Nature, stocks had not staged a comeback. Kurlansky notes that the fish fillets and fish sticks originally were made out of cod, and then were replaced by haddock, and then by redfish, and lately by Pacific pollock. These days, he notes dryly, fish is whatever is left. And we can't stop overfishing because we have over 7 billion mouths to feed. It's not just overfishing. The oceans have absorbed 90% of the greenhouse gases that we have dumped into the atmosphere, and they are becoming ever more acidic. In case you haven't heard, coral reefs around the world are dying. We are destroying the diversity of life on this planet. You may have heard about the polar bears and the whales, but we don't even know how many species we have already wantonly destroyed. We don't much care to tell the truth. Take a look at this YouTube on the sixth extinction.
I call it safe.
The California golden bear, the great auk, the passenger pigeon, the Tasmanian tiger, the Pinta Island tortoise, the golden toad, all dead, and the killer is right there in the room with you. The walls of France's Lascaux cave hold some of humankind's earliest art, almost mythical species, a woolly rhinoceros, enormous antlered megaloceros elk, and massive aurochs. The artists live on and became us, but those cave walls are the last place that those animals still run. They're gone, extinct. We all pretty much understand extinction. It's when a species kicks the proverbial bucket, it rides off into the great biological sunset, bites the dust from whence it came and shall return, which is all just a pretty way of saying that every last one of them dies. Even kids are used to the idea that sometimes groups of living things just don't exist anymore, or mostly don't exist. But extinction as a thing is a surprisingly new concept. In the 1790s, by studying various fossils, naturalist Georges Cuvier was the first to show that they were not from living yet undiscovered creatures, as many thought, but from what he called lost species. In the decades to come, scientists like Charles Lyell and old Chuck Darwin began to popularize the idea that Earth's processes like geology, evolution, and even extinction did occur, just very, very, very slowly. So slowly that we'd surely never actually see something go extinct. The idea of so-called catastrophic change was just impossible. It wasn't until the 1980s that scientists were able to shake that idea. Geologist Walter Alvarez was puzzled by the sudden disappearance of tiny aquatic fossils between two rock layers that dated from about 66 million years ago, which is the same age as the last dinosaurs. With the help of his Nobel Prize-winning father, he analyzed the chemistry of that boundary and found iridium levels that were off the charts. There's usually not much iridium in Earth's crust, but it's very common in asteroids. So Alvarez's theory? A 10-kilometer wide rock collided with Earth, wiping out 75% of Earth's plants and animals. To be honest, scientists kind of laughed at that idea, until the 1991 discovery of the Chicxulub crater near the Yucatan Peninsula finally settled it. Everything alive today is a descendant of a survivor of that terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, the so-called Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction event, the most recent of the Big Five. You should feel pretty lucky. When we look at all of Earth's fossil record together, 98% of the species that have ever lived are extinct. Only they haven't always disappeared at a constant rate. In the history of life on Earth, we know of 5 different mass extinctions, when a majority of life on Earth at the time disappeared in the blink of a geologic eye. Besides the most recent dino killer, there's the Triassic-Jurassic, late Devonian, Ordovician-Silurian, and the worst of all, the end Permian. This was the mother of mass extinctions. It wiped out as many as 96% of Earth's species. So, of course, it got the best nickname, the Great Dino. And we've learned all about these just in time to get some very bad news. We are in the 6th mass extinction, and this time, we are the asteroid. The hard facts of life mean that even when things are going pretty well on Earth, there's a background rate of extinction. Among mammals, for instance, we'd expect to see one species go extinct every 700 years, or maybe one amphibian every 1,000 years. Studies of current extinction rates say that we are roughly 1,000 times past that. And in some groups like amphibians, they're disappearing 45,000 times faster than normal. And since there are so many species still unknown or uncharacterized, all of those numbers are probably underestimates. Goodbye, gastric brooding frog, Pyrenean ibex, the Formosan clouded leopard. We could have been friends. So how do we know that we're to blame? Around 13,000 years ago, as Earth thawed from its most recent big freeze, all of our favorite weird megafauna, like the woolly mammoth, the Smilodon, our old friend Megatherium, disappeared from the earth thanks to a changing climate and the invention of sharp, stabby hunting tools. I really wish we had saved the 8-foot-long beaver, though. That would be awesome. Along the way, through hunting and farming, humans have been altering ecosystems in small but significant ways. But since the Industrial Revolution, man, we have really kicked it into overdrive. With the exception of maybe the first bacteria to breathe oxygen into the air, no living thing has ever altered life on Earth to the degree that we have, which is why scientists now refer to the current epoch as the Anthropocene.
We are the ultimate problem. There are 7 billion people on the planet. We tend to destroy critical habitats where species live. We tend to be warming the planet. We tend to be very careless about moving species around the planet.
According to a 2014 paper by Stuart Pym in Science, link in the doobly-doo, the main cause of the current extinction is human population growth and increased consumption. But those two things lead to a whole mess of threats. The most obvious are climate change and habitat destruction. Scientists found that most land species actually have very small ranges, so they can't just pack up and move when we cut down their forest or turn it into a desert. Ocean species have more freedom to move to better waters, unless they're coral reefs. But thanks to the highest atmospheric CO2 concentrations in 800,000 years, turning the oceans more acidic, anything with a calcium-based shell has nowhere to run or swim. If current trends hold up and the ocean hits pH 7.8 by the end of the century, it could wipe out 1/3 of the species in the ocean. Then there's the invaders. Thanks to a species of snake hitching a ride on military cargo in the 1940s, Guam has lost all of its native birds.
I have had it with these
invasive
snakes on this
Guam-bound cargo.
plane.
And in Africa's Lake Victoria, hundreds of species of cichlid fish just vanished after fishermen introduced the Nile perch. Go us. Now we're erasing species faster than we can even name them. Stanford's Rodolfo Dirzo says that in the past 40 years, invertebrate populations, which might make up 97% of species on Earth, have declined 45% worldwide. And that's just the ones we know about. There's a link in the doobly-doo, that one too. You have to feel worst for the amphibians. Over the past 350 million years, they've survived multiple mass extinctions. But this time, we're giving them all we've got. Dirzo gives this loss of animal life a pretty harmless sounding name, defaunation. But there is nothing cute about it. There is not a group of living things on Earth today that is not threatened by the current and coming extinction. That includes us. Extinction is about more than gorillas, tigers, polar bears, and rhinos, and the dozens of other famous or charismatic species out there. Those are all important and worth saving, but we need to care just as much about the humble beetles and the ugly little worms and the slimy frogs. Every species, big or small, panda or protozoa, is important and worth saving, whether or not we understand exactly why it's worth saving. John Muir once said, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find that it is bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything in the universe." I put some links down in the description where you can get to know some of Earth's less.
If you're interested, I recommend Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction and Unnatural History, 2014. She won a Pulitzer Prize for the book, and it describes what the situation is for us now. The freak storm that froze the entire center of the country and plunged Texas into a nightmare of suffering was predicted by scientists who said that we should expect extreme weather events and that this is just what we're getting. Our electrical grid can't handle the strain. Never mind Texas. The electric went out in 5 different states. It's not just the electrical grid, however. We don't have the infrastructure to withstand any crisis. Look at Flint. Our water systems throughout the country are all aging and in need of repair. But like the roads, there is no money to do the repairs. And unlike the roads, you don't see it. So that we're all threatened by a deterioration of our water systems, and all of them have lead in them. Scientists didn't warn us that the extreme weather might happen. They said that it would happen again and again and again, and it's going to get much worse. I don't get my news from Facebook or Twitter. I get it from my news from Science Magazine, which is published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science and is one of the world's leading magazines of science. And then there are the things that you probably just don't care about, like the locust plague in Africa and the Middle East, the growing global hunger, the rising tide of refugees fleeing both from climate change and war. Maybe you are at least aware that refugees are fleeing desperate conditions in Central and South America and heading for our borders. Perhaps you think we ought to be keeping them out, or maybe you think that we should let them in, but it probably isn't something that keeps you up at night. Here is what is happening. Our civilization can't handle the strain. And like the Ottoman Empire, our civilization is going to collapse. But worse, species extinction is going to bring about an end to our species. Yes, folks, your professor believes that humans don't have much time left. Our number is up, and I don't believe that we can save ourselves. So the reason that I believe that the modern corporation is evil is primarily because it will lead to the destruction of our civilization and ultimately to our species and most of the rest of life on the planet. Let's take a moment to talk about the collapse of Western civilization now. You might recognize the title as I've assigned it to all my classes, all my students. It's a tiny little book. It costs less than $10, and I posted the PDFs for your convenience. The Collapse of Western Civilization is an amazing little book. The National Academy of Sciences asked the two most prominent historians of science in the world to write a very simple little book to explain to people the dangers that we face. They came up with a book that starts out as a history, but then imagines where we go from our present. They present a horrifying future in which our entire civilization collapses, just like the empires collapsed in World War I. Of course, you have always believed that your future is in your own hands. You work hard and you'll succeed. I believe that no matter how hard you work, your life is going to be miserable. The power will fail, the food supply will fail, and there will be violence everywhere. If there is another future, you'll have to find it on your own. Thank you. And with that, I'll say good night.